We really can't have a conversation about contingencies without talking about cancellations, without talking about deposits, without talking about risk. When we talk about contingencies overall, the word contingency is not something that we use in our language very often. Contingencies have to deal with verbiage that's written on your residential purchase agreement and through negotiations throughout your contract. It's not a common word that we use when we're just having a conversation with our family and friends. So what I want to accomplish in this video is a few things. I want to help you get a better understanding of what the contingencies are, what they mean, and how they are applicable to your clients and in your real estate transaction. I truly do believe that the better you can understand these contingencies, the better you will be able to explain those to your clients. But I totally get it. When we look at the residential purchase agreement, it's size 6 font, 16 pages. There's a lot of verbiage. So I want to show you what the time frames are and just do my best to simplify it as much as humanly possible. I think with the new changes of the residential purchase agreement, it's done a really good thing and it's simplified where all this information is. We're going to be able to look at the chart and break down what paragraph, what section, what statement, what does that mean. At the end of this video, I'm going to go over some frequently asked questions that have been commonly asked by you guys, the agents. Make sure you want to stick around for those. Now let's dive right in contingencies, but take your time. Read the paragraphs, ask your questions. Let's all get a better understanding so that we're all more confident when explaining contingencies. So let's first look at the definition of a contingency. A contingency is a clause in a real estate purchase agreement that specifies an action or requirement that must be met so that the transaction can continue. It's basically a circumstance. If you want to replace the word contingency with circumstance, that absolutely works. Something has to happen in order for the transaction to continue. Just a few quick examples of a contingency. Let's just imagine that you're representing a buyer. In reality, when you're representing your buyer, what do? You go out there, you show them the property, they look around for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes at the most, and then at that point is when they usually decide whether or not they want to purchase this $500,000, three-quarter, multi-million-dollar property. So the buyer has certain rights that they're entitled to. They're not going to accomplish that right on the spot. They are going to be allotted a certain period of time, and we're going to cover that in this video. But the buyer is going to have the right to inspect a property, obtain a loan, get an appraisal on it. They're going to have those basic rights. Or on the flip side, let's talk about a seller. We often have sellers who want to buy a replacement property. They want to sell their property and buy another property, but they don't want to be left homeless, or maybe they don't want to move 2 or 3 times. The seller may add an additional circumstance, a contingency that says that they have to find a replacement property in order to sell their current property. Those are both prime examples of contingencies, but we're going to go through each one in detail. There are 4 main categories when we're talking about contingencies for buyers and for sellers. By the way, contingencies are really more protecting the buyer than they are the seller. So the majority of my video and references are going to be really about talking about the buyer from the buyer's agent point of view. The 4 main categories are loan, appraisal, investigation, and the sale or purchase. So let's first start off talking about the buyer contingencies. Before we even begin, take a moment, look at your residential purchase agreement, look at page 2, go to section 3L. From 3L1 to 3L8 are all different contingencies for the buyer. The column just to the right of it, you'll see where it says 8A, 8B, 8C, 12, 8D, 14A. These are all sections in your purchase agreement that you can refer to get a further explanation of that particular contingency. I'm not going to read them to you. I think if you want to take the time to learn contingencies, look at the line, look at 13A, 14A, 11K, whatever it reads, take the time and go read that part. Go read that section and get a better understanding of what that contingency actually means. That's going to make you just a more confident, well-informed, overall better agent. So before we start discussing the 4 main categories of contingencies, I want to talk about the time frames. If you look right in the middle of this agreement here, you're going to see 17. The contract is pre-written to state 17 days. You basically have 17 days from contract acceptance to conduct these investigations, to conduct the loan approval, to conduct the appraisal, to review the HOA disclosures, to review the seller disclosures. If there are at least solar panels on the roof and your buyer is going to be assuming responsibility of them, they have 17 days to review that agreement and do their investigations. And as you'll see in the middle section here, you got 17, and then in parentheses you got or, and then a blank line. You can absolutely shorten or lengthen these contingencies, but if you shorten any of these contingency timeframes, you have to know that there is more risk for the buyer and of course less risk for the seller. And in certain markets where it's ultra competitive, shortening the contingencies is a good move. You better be on top of it. There's no time to be wasted. Shortening contingencies is a common practice that I personally use, and a lot of your competitors use as well too. You can also extend your contingencies by increasing the days. Instead of 17 days, you can put in 21 or 30 days. The problem with that scenario is that it's more risk for the seller. And again, in an ultra competitive market, when the seller has 10, 15, 30 plus offers to choose from, if you're writing offers with extended contingency times, I wish you nothing but the best of luck getting your offer accepted. So let's talk about the first main category, which is the loan contingency. This line can be found in 3L1 of your purchase agreement. To further elaborate the loan contingency, it can be found in section 8A in your purchase agreement. So let's talk about what the loan contingency means. In layman's terms, essentially the loan contingency is stating that the buyer has X amount of days, 17 days, to process the mortgage loan and obtain loan approval. Now I get it, your buyer has already submitted their taxes, their pay stubs, their bank statements, the mortgage lender has reviewed everything, issued them a fancy paper that says pre-approval, your client is pre-approved for $800,000. There's still a process that takes place. The lender still has to verify the validity of your social security number, verify the taxes, employment. The underwriter is going to review the entire transaction file and give their okay on it. The loan still needs to be underwritten, and that stuff takes time. 17 days is more than enough time. If I am your listing agent and you still don't have your loan approval in 17 days, I assure you I'm going to be asking you questions. The things that cause most loans to be delayed, I would definitely say submitting a paperwork. Sometimes the lender's going to ask the borrower for a few extra documents, and if it takes the borrower 2, 3, 4, 5 days to get that, that's going to delay the whole process. Or maybe sometimes your buyer doesn't reply or doesn't feel that it's urgent to reply or submit this document. That's all going to cause delays. Or maybe your client's going on vacation. Guess what? Nobody cares that they're going on vacation. You still have a contractual time frame. The seller wants to close within a certain period of time. Your loan has to be done within a certain period of time, and you need their cooperation. Sometimes the employer takes a long time to verify employment. Again, a lot of different things, but the best way to prevent all of this is to set the right expectation up front. As you're doing your buyer consultation, you and your lender should have this conversation with your client that emphasizes urgency. They need to reply. They need to submit their documents. They need to work with you guys so that you can process this loan smoothly. If you are going to reduce the contingency time frame, do have a conversation with your mortgage lender and make sure they're okay with it as well. When you're thinking about the loan contingency, let's just sum it up and make it easy. You have X amount of time to finalize your loan. If you need more time, you can always ask for a longer period of time, but you should have a reason on why you need more time. The listing agent's definitely going to ask for it. Another way to look at it is if you have X amount of days, 17 days to get your loan, the seller also took their property off the market for 17 days. The seller is relying on your good word that your loan is approved and that you're going to be able to obtain the funds needed to purchase the property. If your buyer is unable to obtain a mortgage loan within that period of time, the seller also lost time because they couldn't market the property. They couldn't accept anyone's offer. They could have lost other offers that were higher and better than yours. It's imperative that all parties understand what the loan contingency means, and it simply means a specified period of time that allows the buyer to obtain a mortgage for the property that they're purchasing. The second main category that we want to discuss here is the appraisal contingency. On page 2 of your purchase agreement, line 3L2, this is where the appraisal contingency is referenced. If you go to 8B, this section will elaborate more about the appraisal contingency, what you can and can't do, so take the time to read that. So what is an appraisal contingency? Let's sum it up. No one wants to overpay for a property. You don't want to overpay, I don't want to overpay. Nobody really, truly wants to overpay. And I can assure you, if you're obtaining a mortgage loan, Your lender doesn't want you to overpay either. They don't want to give you more money on a home than what it's actually worth. So what the appraisal contingency means is that the buyer is allowed a certain period of time to hire a third-party appraiser, a licensed appraiser, to value the property that they are purchasing. Now, I do say the buyer hires, but they're not really hiring. Actually, the lender will actually be the one that hires the appraiser, but the buyer is the one who pays for it. Within that specified period of time, the appraiser needs to determine, is the property worth what the buyer is paying for it. So for example, if you're buying a home for $800,000 and your appraiser goes out there and the appraiser says it's worth $750,000, guess what? You're overpaying for the property. Again, the appraisal contingency is giving the buyer a certain period of time. Per the contract, it's 17 days. In an ultra-competitive market, you'll see this appraisal contingency be reduced from 17 days to 14 days to 10 days to 7 days, and also just flat out removed. When that no appraisal contingency box is checked, that means that in the event the appraisal value is low, like our example, $800,000 contract price, the appraiser appraised it at $750,000. The buyer is basically agreeing to pay the difference from $750,000 to $800,000, an additional $50,000. Now that's a super ultra risky move. No one really wants to do that, especially when it's all hinging upon the appraiser appraising a property. Yes, you can pull comps, but the comps that you pull and the value that you come up with really doesn't mean anything because it'll be all up to the appraiser. So in the event an appraisal is low and you still have an appraisal contingency, only one of four things can possibly happen. Option number one, the seller reduces the price to the appraised value. And this is a good thing because your buyer just basically got a discount. They were willing to pay more, but now they're going to be paying less, so that's good. Option number two, the buyer pays the difference. This one, flat out, your buyer is overpaying for the property. The buyer is paying the difference from the appraised price to the contract price. The seller's super happy because they're selling their home for more than what it's actually worth. Option number three is that the buyer and the seller negotiate. Maybe they meet halfway. The seller comes down in price, the buyer comes up in price, the transaction closes, and that's about it. Now, it doesn't always have to be halfway. It could be buyer comes up 10,000, seller comes down X. Like, it doesn't really matter. Some type of negotiation to continue the transaction moving forward. And the last and final option is cancellation. Seller doesn't want to come down, buyer doesn't want to come up in price. You really can't move forward because you're not going to be able to obtain a mortgage loan, and that's it. Just a few additional notes when we're talking about appraisals. If you look at 3L2, the third column from the left, you'll see some verbiage that says appraisal contingency based upon appraised value at minimum of purchase price. And then you'll see this or with this checkbox and a number sign and a blank line. So this section here was added. So instead of waiving the appraisal contingency, it's not really fair to your buyer to basically write a blank check and agree to a number that they don't know. Sometimes your buyer will be a little hesitant on waiving the full appraisal contingency, but your buyer might say to you, I am willing to pay over the appraised price up to X amount of dollars. Well, for this example, let's say it's $20,000. So if we wrote our contract at $800,000, the buyer's willing to pay $20,000 over the appraised price. The way that we would write this into our contract is in section 3L2. In that section that says appraisal, we would mark the box right after it says or, and we would write in $780,000. What this essentially means is that the property must appraise at least $780,000 in order for the buyer to pay the $800,000 contracted price. That $20,000 price difference is what the buyer is agreeing to automatically. Now, if that appraisal is conducted and let's just say it comes in at $750,000, now $750,000 is the appraisal, contract price is $800,000, that's a difference of $50,000. Remember, in this box, your buyer wrote $780,000, which is only $20,000 difference. This means we go back to the negotiation table and have a conversation on how to continue this transaction forward. The other note I need to mention about the appraisal contingency, on the far right under the contingency remove section, you'll see the box that says no appraisal contingency, which you can check. You'll see the verbiage that says a removal of appraisal contingency does not eliminate appraisal cancellation rights in FVAC. The FVAC is the FHA/VA amendatory clause form, and you gotta take a moment to read this document, but let me simplify this for you. If your buyer is using an FHA or VA loan, they cannot waive the appraisal contingency up front. And again, in an ultra competitive market where you got conventional loans that have the ability to waive the appraisal, if your buyer is FHA or VA, they simply cannot. And that's why this statement was added here, because when you're writing an offer FHA or VA, this document, this FVAC form, is automatically attached to your purchase agreement. And this form here is telling you that your borrower, your client, must do an appraisal, obtain that value before they agree to pay the difference or negotiate with that contract to appraise price. Again, appraisals are a key topic in today's market. It's a very important topic to discuss because, again, no one wants to overpay, but you have to know that the appraisal contingency is ultra important, ultra vital to your transaction. You need to know what it means, what the options are, and what the repercussions are if they choose to waive it and eliminate it from the contract solely. The third main contingency that we want to discuss is the investigation category. Now, investigation covers a whole wide range of different things. We're not just talking about the physical condition of the property. We're talking about all the aspects that pertain to the property. I'm referring to the neighborhood, the area, the schools. We're talking about meganslaw.ca.gov, registered sex offenders. We're talking about previous insurance claims. We're talking about city rules, rights, noise complaints, crime reports. We're talking about all the other rights that your buyer has other than the loan and the appraisal. Going way back to my example earlier, you got a buyer who's seen a property for 10-15 minutes and all of a sudden they write an offer, they get their offer accepted at $800,000, and now they're buying this property. Now they have to submit their initial deposit. Now they're in escrow. Per the contract in section 3L3, 3L4, 3L5, 3L6, and 3L7, all of this falls under the investigation contingency. And as you notice right in the center here, that's 17 days to really do those inspections. Now, the physical aspects of the property, the roof, the plumbing, electricity, what's wrong with the property? Does it need repairs? Is there mold? Whatever you got to investigate. Most people think like that's the only thing that you're inspecting, but that's actually not the case. The buyer has the right to investigate all aspects of the property that they're about to invest in. Let me put it in 3 subcategories for you. We're going to talk about the physical aspects of your investigations. Let's talk about the disclosures section of your investigations. And then let's also talk about the reports section of your investigations. So when we're talking about the physical aspects, like I said earlier, roof, plumbing, electricity, HVAC system, plumbing condition, electrical outlets, anything physically that you can touch and feel at the property. And normally you would hire a general home inspector for this. 17 days is the pre-written time, but also in section 3L3, there's an additional verbiage that says informational access to property. The buyer has the right to access the property. You can't open escrow and the seller says, no, you can't have a roofer come to the property. I work from home and you can't do that. The seller must allow reasonable access to the property so that the buyer can do their investigations. The typical time frame for this is 17 days. Now, any of these investigation costs are all the responsibility of the buyer. Buyers can absolutely say, no, I don't want to do any inspections. They absolutely have the right to do that. However, we are always going to advise them, hey, you should do your investigations because if something happens after the close of escrow, you can't come back at me. The second subcategory of the investigation contingency is the disclosures. Now, every seller has a legal obligation to disclose what they know about the property. Anybody die in the home? Is there something that always happens when you turn on this light, that light turns off, the power trips? The seller has to disclose repairs that they did to the property, any nuisances, issues, problems that they have with the property. Now, this is a little bit hard one because if the client has been there for 20, 30 years, it's probably impossible for them to list all of the repairs and things that they've done, things that have happened and occurred on the property. The key word of this is reasonable. The seller has to disclose within reason, did they repair something, what happened, and explain it to the buyer so the buyer is fully informed. As a seller, when in doubt, just disclose it. The seller is going to fill out the questionnaires such as the transfer disclosure statement, the seller property questionnaire. They're going to answer that questionnaire, that affidavit, as truthful as possible. The buyer is going to receive that document. The buyer is going to have an opportunity to review that document. If they have additional questions they can ask. The buyer has the right to review those disclosures that were completed by the seller. The third subcategory that I want to discuss are the reports. This is referring to the preliminary title report, the natural hazard disclosure report. This is the part where the buyer has an opportunity to investigate with the city regarding building codes, permits. The buyer has the right to do all this. The buyer also has the right to search meganslaw.ca.gov, see if there's any registered sex offenders. Maybe if they want their child to be in a certain school district or school, this is the time for the buyer to do their investigations and research the schools. Add another one here. If the buyer is buying a property that has solar panels on there, whether they're paid off or leased, doesn't really matter. The buyer has the right to investigate that solar panels, the usage. They have the right to ask questions to get a little bit more information on the property that they're purchasing that has these solar panels owned by a third party. If your client's buying within a homeowners association, I think it's important for the buyer to understand what the rules are, what the parking is, what are the owners' meetings. What can they be fined for? What can they build? What colors can they paint their home? All of this falls under this third subcategory. All of this essentially falls under the inspection contingency. Bottom line is they're allowed a certain period of time to review the property in detail and basically determine, do we want to move forward or do we not want to move forward? And yes, they have the right to ask for repairs. They have the right to question. They have the right to do that. They have the right to do all of that within the period specified on your contract. The fourth category of contingencies is actually going to be applicable to the buyers, but also the sellers. Sometimes when people are buying properties, they have a property to sell. On page 2, section 3L8 of your purchase agreement, it says sale of buyer's property. Sale of buyer's property is not a contingency. That's the way that the contract is pre-written, unless checked here. So if you write this offer and you check this box, CAR form COP, contingency for sale of buyer's property, is automatically attached to your purchase agreement. This form here is going to explain the time frames and the rights that your buyer has. If your buyer is buying the seller's property but is unable to sell their current property, that of course is going to affect the property that they're trying to buy as well too. Time frames are listed on this form. This form here needs to be added to protect your buyer so that they're not legally obligated to buy this property if they can't sell their property. Now, I know we haven't spent that much time talking about sellers because sellers really don't have that many contingencies. Really, their main contingency isn't even listed on this purchase agreement. It's common that sellers have to find a replacement property in order to sell their property. Sellers don't want to be homeless. You don't want to be homeless. You don't want to be forced to sell your property and have nowhere to go. So what happens is sellers will add in a clause into a counteroffer, a multiple counteroffer or a seller's counteroffer stating that the sale of their property is contingent upon the seller's purchase of a replacement property, that the seller doesn't have to sell their property unless they find a replacement property. Now, I know we're talking a lot of different scenarios, a lot of things can happen. What if the seller doesn't find a replacement property? What if the buyer cancels during the transaction? Well, it gets so complicated. No one ever said this was going to be easy, but just understanding that if the sellers have a contingency, the buyer's purchase will not go through unless the seller finds a replacement home. Now, hopefully you have a better understanding of what the contingencies are. You have the loan contingency, you have the appraisal contingency, you have the investigation contingency, and if there is a sale or a purchase contingency added to it, that one will be applicable. The contract states that there is a certain period of time, whether it's the default contract days of 17 days, or maybe the contingencies were removed. All contingencies require an action, a written removal of that contingency in order to be valid or removed. In order to remove any contingency, any right, it must be done in writing using CAR form CR, also known as the contingency removal form. Before I begin explaining this contingency removal form, we got to look at section 3. You're going to notice in section 3 that it's written in bold. Anything that's written in bold is important. Anything that's written in all caps and in bold is ultra important. But we have to take a moment to read this, and it simply says, once all contingencies are removed, whether or not buyer has satisfied him, her, itself regarding all contingencies or received any information relating to those contingencies, buyer may not be entitled to a return of buyer's deposit if buyer does not close escrow. This could happen even if, for example, buyer does not approve of some aspect of the property or lender does not approve the buyer's loan. Simply, if your buyer removes all their contingencies and on the day before closing they change their mind, they lose their job, can't get a loan, they find out a registered sex offender lives across the street, they find out that it's not in the school district, too bad, they may not be entitled to their deposit. When you are getting this form signed by your client, I call it the point of no return. Your client needs to know what they're signing away because they are signing away their rights. They're simply saying, hey, our loan is approved, I'm confident on my loan, we're waiving that contractual right. When they're signing off their appraisal contingency, they're saying the appraisal has been done, the value is in, we agree with it, we're moving forward. When they sign off their investigation contingency, the buyer is saying we are satisfied with the condition of the property, we want to move forward in its present condition. If they're buying within an HOA, when they remove that contingency, they're simply saying we agree with the rules, we adhere towards the rules of the community, we're signing away that right. When they remove all the contingencies, the buyer is all in, they agree with it all, they're moving forward. On this contingency removal form, you'll fill out the top section, you'll fill out all the appropriate information, you'll read section 1. In section 2, you make a choice. In section 2, you're either going to choose A, B, or C. In section A, you can select which contingencies you want to remove. In section B, you can remove all of them except for. And then in section C, you remove all of them. The buyer signs the bottom, submits it to the listing side. At the far bottom of this contingency removal form, you'll see where it says seller removal of seller contingencies. And this one here, you'll see where it says seller hereby removes the following seller contingencies. That's either finding the replacement property or closing on the replacement property. Seller will sign and date. If you are representing the buyer, you have a contractual obligation per your purchase agreement to remove the applicable contingencies in the time frame stated on the contract. If you are a buyer's agent and that seller has a contingency to find a replacement property or close on a replacement property, the buyer's agent has the duty to demand the listing side, the seller, to remove that applicable contingency. Vice versa as well. The listing agent has the right to demand the buyer's agent to remove that applicable contingency in the time frame specified on the contract. I know that was a lot of words there. Rewind that, listen to it a few times. The contract is actually really simple, and it simply says within a specified period of time, the buyer has the right to do certain actions such as obtain a mortgage loan, conduct an appraisal, do their investigations. If they cannot perform those within a specified period of time, the seller may cancel the agreement, go back on the market, go with a backup offer, and find another buyer. If the seller has a contingency, they have a specified period of time to find a replacement property or close on a replacement property. If they cannot perform that action in the time allowed, the buyer may cancel the transaction. So since we're talking about cancellation, in order for any cancellation to take place, one document must be provided to the other party, basically warning them of said cancellation. We're talking about card forms NBP, which is notice to buyer to perform, and NSP, which is notice to seller to perform. As we look at the notice of buyer to perform, you'll see a lot of different options, a lot of different boxes. In order for the seller to demand the buyer to remove the contingency, the seller has to complete this form, select the applicable contingencies, sign it, and send it over to the buyer's agent. When this happens, at the bottom section here, again, you see it in bold, it simply says you have 2 days to act. You have 2 days to remove that applicable contingency, or the seller may cancel the transaction. The notice of seller to perform looks pretty similar as well too, not as many options, but the same principles apply. If the buyer wants to cancel the transaction, they must first issue the form notice the seller to perform, select the applicable contractual action, sign it, send it over to the seller's agent. They have 2 days to take action, or the buyer may cancel the transaction. Can my buyer cancel because they found another property? The simple answer to this is no. There is no clause in the contract that says, hey buyer, if you find another property while you're under contract with this buyer, you can cancel the transaction. We have to remember the 4 categories of contingencies, basically cancellation reasons of why a buyer can cancel: due to the investigation, due to the appraisal, due to the sale of the buyer's property, or the loan contingency. Now, if you're weak in escrow and you just did your inspection and the buyer wants to open escrow with another property and use the investigation contingency to cancel the transaction so they can move to another property.
You're a thin ice, buddy.
In theory, yeah, but you are dancing a fine line. Just make sure you have your ducks in a row if that is the route that you're going. Can a buyer cancel because they changed their mind?
So, Cyrus, we got a little mind changer.
Going back to my previous answer, no, there is no mind changer clause in the contract that says, oh, hey, we're 21 days in this transaction and you know what? I changed my mind. I don't want to buy a home at all. No, there is no clause in the contract that says that. 4 contingencies of categories, and those are the only reasons your buyer can cancel. It must be for one of those contractual reasons. Is it risky to reduce the time frames of the contingencies?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is absolutely risky to reduce the time frames because your client is allowed a certain period of time and you're reducing that time frame. Now, in an ultra-competitive market, it is common practice to remove those contingencies or to be countered by the seller to reduce those time frames, but that's a conversation that you have to have with your client and your lender to make sure that you can adhere towards those time frames and make sure that you can explain that to your client and inform them of the action that's about to take place. What happens if the contingencies are not removed on time?
Unacceptable!
When contingencies are not removed on time, that's never acceptable, but it does happen. Either party, the buyer or the seller, can request the time to be extended. And the way that this would be done is by using CAR Form ETA, Extension of Time Addendum. Complete the top section of the form. If you're requesting to extend a specific contingency, that would be completed in Section 2. The person requesting the extension would sign the bottom and send it to the other party. What happens if the other party doesn't want to agree to the extension? Easy. You can issue a notice of buyer to perform or notice a seller to perform and cancel the transaction. Can the transaction still close if the contingencies are not removed in writing?
It's all good, brother.
Yes, the transaction can still close if the contingency removals are not received in writing. However, best practice, whether you're representing the buyer or the seller, you do want to get these removed in writing, but essentially the transaction can close even if no contingency removals are completed. Can my client remove only certain contingencies? Absolutely. Using CAR Form CR, contingency removal, in Section 2, this is the section where the buyer can remove specific portions of that contingency and not remove all of them. We're 14 days into our transaction and my buyer still hasn't received the HOA documents yet. Do we have to remove the investigation contingency?
That's a complicated question.
The answer to this depends on a few things. Let's just assume that the investigation time frame is actually 17 days and on day 14 you still have not received the HOA documents. On day 17, the buyer may be asked and required to remove the physical inspection portion of the buyer investigation, or maybe the reports section of the investigation. However, the buyer is not going to be obligated or required to remove the condominium plan development HOA contingency. Adding a little extra to that, let's just say that the HOA documents were received on day 17. The buyer is still not required to remove that applicable contingency because the contract states that the buyer will have 5 days from receipt to review the applicable information.
Don't rush me. Don't rush me.
So bottom line is, if you're on day 17, day 20, and you just received those documents, you're allowed 5 days to review those documents before you will be required to remove the applicable contingency. My buyer doesn't really want to remove the appraisal contingency. Can we just make the offer with no appraisal contingency, do the appraisal right away, and if it doesn't appraise at value, we can cancel for another reason like the loan or the investigation?
I am very, very sneaky, sir.
Something no one has thought of. Something crazy.
Easy answer to this is no. Review your purchase agreement, review Section 8A1 and Section 8B1. Both of these statements and paragraphs protect the seller against this exact situation. Yes, we're trying to be sneaky and say, oh, hey, let's do no appraisal contingency, do it right away. And if it comes in low, we'll basically lie and say we're going to cancel because of any other reason. You're playing with fire. The seller doesn't have to agree to this cancellation. Your buyer could lose money. Don't do it. If the seller has to find a replacement property in order to sell, when does my buyer's investigation, loan, and appraisal contingency timeframe start? Also, when is my buyer required to send in their initial deposit to escrow?
That's a great question.
This is a really good question, and in order to answer this question, you need to review the SPRP form, which is the seller's purchase of a replacement property. In section 2, it's going to discuss the time periods, it's going to discuss the buyer's deposit. To simplify it, nothing starts until the seller has submitted a written notice stating that they have found their replacement property. So basically no time frame start until the seller has found their replacement property. It's been 17 days since our offer was accepted. What if the seller has trouble finding a replacement property? What can the buyer do?
Not a damn thing.
Easy answer, nothing. The buyer willingly entered into this agreement knowing that the sale was contingent upon the seller finding a replacement property. If the seller doesn't find a property, the seller doesn't have to sell their property. The buyer then can't buy their property. It's been 30 days since my buyer's offer was accepted and we're ready to close the loan. We even have the rate lock about to expire. But the seller still hasn't found a replacement property. What can the buyer do?
Not a damn thing.
Can only wait helplessly.
Again, nothing. Unless the seller has identified the replacement property in writing, no time frames are starting, and they are still not obligated to complete this transaction of selling their home unless they have removed their applicable selling contingency.